Every game show runs on the same fundamental premise, that human beings, when placed under pressure and asked to predict what other human beings think, will reveal something true about themselves in the process of trying to guess. The survey is not really about the survey. The questions are not really about the questions. They are about the person answering them, about what they reach for first when time is short and the stakes are real and the ordinary filters that govern polished social performance have been stripped away by the bright lights and the clock and the 200 people watching. Most of the time, what people reach for is the obvious thing, the safe answer. The answer that 100 ordinary people would recognize and nod at and say, yes, of course, that is right. The answer that wins. And then, occasionally, rarely, in the specific way that genuine surprises are rare in a format that has been running long enough to have seen most things, someone reaches for something else entirely. Something that is not the obvious answer and is not the safe answer and is not, in any conventional sense, the winning answer. But which is, in the way that only the truest things are true, exactly right. Vivienne Osa was 53 years old, a grief counselor from Columbus, Ohio, and she had been standing at the Fast Money podium for approximately 3 seconds when Steve Harvey asked her a question he had asked hundreds of contestants before her. The question was simple. The answer the survey expected was simple. The answer Vivienne gave was not simple, and it was not expected, and it stopped Steve Harvey, a man who had been stopped by very few things in 30 years behind a microphone, in a way that every person in that studio would spend the rest of their lives describing. What she said was not clever. It was not strategic. It was not designed to produce the effect it produced. It was simply true, in the way that things said by people who spend their professional lives inside the deepest. Human experiences tend to be true, with the unfiltered, unperforming quality of someone who has sat in too many honest rooms to reach for anything less in any room, including this one. Bored when it turned, confirmed something that the audience had already understood was happening, that on this particular afternoon in this particular studio, the survey and the truth had arrived at the same place by completely different routes. Vivienne Ose had come to grief counseling the way that many people come to the work that defines them, through the back door of personal experience, in circumstances that did not feel at the time like professional formation, but which turned out to be exactly that. She was 29 years old when her husband Isaac died, a sudden, unforewarned cardiac event on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday morning in March, in the parking lot of the elementary school where he taught 4th grade. He was 31. They had been married for 3 years. Their son, Nathan, was 18 months old. She did not romanticize what followed. In the interviews she gave in the months after the Family Feud episode aired, she was consistent in her description of the grief she had navigated. It was not poetic and it was not redemptive, and it did not arrive with the structured stages that the popular literature suggested. It arrived as a condition, pervasive, weather-like, present in every room she entered and every decision she made. She had a toddler and a mortgage and a career as a high school guidance counselor that required her to be functional during business hours. And so she was functional during business hours, and she returned to the rest of it at the end of each day with the grim, practical discipline of someone who understands that the work cannot be avoided, only deferred. What helped her, what she would later describe as the thing that made the difference between navigating the grief and being administered by it, was a grief support group she joined at the recommendation of her own therapist, 6 months after Isaac's death. The group met on Thursday evenings in the basement of a church in Columbus, and it was facilitated by a woman named Dr. Patricia Amos, who had been doing this work for 20 years, and who had, in those 20 years, developed a quality that Vivienne recognized immediately and did not have the vocabulary for at the time. The quality of being completely comfortable inside the most difficult human experiences, not because they did not affect her, but because she had learned to let them pass through rather than accumulate. Vivienne watched Dr. Amos facilitate that group for 14 months before she told her own therapist that she thought she wanted to do what Dr. Amos did. Her therapist asked her what she understood that work to involve. Vivienne said, sitting with people inside the thing they cannot get out of on their own without trying to fix it or move it or make it go faster until they develop the capacity to sit with it themselves. Her therapist said that was the most accurate description of grief counseling she had heard from someone who hadn't been trained in it. She recommended a program. Vivienne enrolled. She had been practicing for 19 years by the time she appeared on Family Feud. She worked primarily with bereaved spouses and bereaved parents. the two populations for whom the grief literature was most consistently inadequate, and the need for sustained, skilled support was most acute. She worked in a practice that she had built from 4 clients in a rented office to a 12-counselor organization that served over 200 active clients and trained new grief counselors through a supervised practicum program. She had written 2 books that were used in grief counseling training programs at 7 universities. She had, by the honest reckoning of her professional community, become one of the most respected voices in her field in the Midwest. She had also, when she had time, been raising Nathan. He was 23 now, finishing a master's degree in education, teaching 4th grade, as his father had in a Columbus elementary school. He had his father's laugh, which Vivienne could still hear in it after 22 years, and which she received each time as the thing it was. Not a wound, not a consolation, but a continuation, the specific form of forward motion that love takes when the person who carried it is no longer present to carry it themselves. The Family Feud application had been Nathan's idea for his mother's 53rd birthday. He had submitted it on a Sunday afternoon with the unsentimental practicality that he had inherited from her. It would be fun, it was something she had never done, and he thought she would be good at it. He had been right on all 3 counts, though the 3rd count would turn out to be accurate in a way he had not precisely anticipated. Vivienne had prepared for the show in the way she prepared for most things, by identifying what the situation required and then applying the most relevant available knowledge to it. She had watched 12 episodes, made notes on answer patterns, and conducted 2 practice sessions with the family over the 2 weeks before the taping. She approached it with the same practical seriousness she brought to everything she did, without the seriousness becoming heaviness. She had learned, through 24 years of sitting with the heaviest human experiences available, the essential difference between taking things seriously and taking things grimly. She took this seriously. She was not grim about it. She was, if anything, looking forward to the lightness of a day with no clinical weight attached to it. A day that was just a game. A day that was just her family in a studio having a good time. The universe, as it sometimes does, had other ideas. The Osai family team, Vivienne, Nathan, her younger sister Abina, Abina's husband Jerome, and Vivienne's closest friend and colleague Dr. Sandra Quay, arrived at the studio in Columbus with the warm, slightly self-conscious energy of people who are not accustomed to being on camera and have decided to enjoy the novelty rather than be managed by it. They were well-dressed and well-organized and genuinely glad to be there, and the production staff, who processed several families each taping week, noted something about the Osai family that several of them mentioned to each other afterward. The warmth in the room was not performed. It had the quality of something old and settled, a closeness that did not require demonstration because it was simply the condition of the room they occupied together. In the pre-show interview, Vivienne talked about her practice, about Nathan's teaching career, about the Columbus food scene, which she discussed with a specificity and enthusiasm that surprised the interviewer and delighted the production staff. She did not mention Isaac. She was not asked about him, and she did not introduce the subject, and this was consistent with the professional and personal discipline she had developed over 2 decades, the discipline of not being defined by loss in contexts where loss was not the relevant frame. Today was a game show. She was here to play. The rest of her story would announce itself if it needed to. It would need to. The opposing family, the Delgado family from San Antonio, a 3-generation group led by a 60-year-old retired firefighter named Roberto, who had the competitive instincts of a man who had spent 30 years running toward dangerous situations and felt entirely comfortable with high-stakes environments, played the main game with a focused energy that kept the Osai family honest throughout. Roberto Delgado at the face-off podium was fast and accurate, and his daughter Carmen, 35, had an instinct for the culturally broad answer, the answer that transcended regional and generational specificity to land in the universal middle. That produced 2 number-1 responses in round 2 and shifted the momentum convincingly toward the Delgado side. Round 3 was close and ended in a steal that the Delgado family executed cleanly, running the board on the Osai family's second strike with 5 consecutive correct answers that brought the audience to its feet and left the Osai family regrouping behind their podium with the specific, contained disappointment of people who have prepared well and are losing anyway. Vivienne, watching from the end of the family line, said nothing. She placed one hand briefly on Nathan's shoulder, once firmly, and then returned her attention to the game. Nathan looked at her and something passed between them that Abina, watching from the other side, later described as the most efficient communication she had ever witnessed between two people. An entire recalibration, delivered in a touch and received in a glance, in under 2 seconds. Round 4 went to the Osais on the strength of Jerome's face-off performance and Sandra's 2 number 1 answers in the back half of the round. Round 5 was the tiebreaker, and it came down, as tiebreakers often do, to the single most straightforward question of the afternoon. Steve Harvey looked at Roberto Delgado and at Vivienne Osai, standing on opposite sides of the center podium, and asked, "Name something people say when someone sneezes." Roberto said, "God bless you." It was, by any reasonable assessment, the correct answer. It was the answer that a significant majority of surveyed Americans would give. It was, on its face, unbeatable. Vivienne said, "Bless you." The survey gave Vivienne the number 1 answer, 44 points, against Roberto's 38, on the grounds that the contracted form was more commonly given than the full phrase. It was a margin of 6 points. It was, by the standards of tiebreakers, razor thin, but it was sufficient. The Osai family won the main game. Fast money was organized, as it had been discussed and agreed, with Nathan going first. He was the youngest and the quickest in the family, and the family's collective assessment was that quickness was an asset in the first fast money position. He scored 144 points, which was a strong performance by any measure. 4 number 1 answers and 1 strong secondary response, delivered with the focused speed of a 23-year-old who had been practicing under his mother's supervision for 2 weeks, and had absorbed, through that practice, her core instruction. Stay ordinary, trust the first answer, do not improve what does not need improvement. 144 points. Vivienne needed 56 to win the $20,000. $56 points was, in the mathematics of fast money, achievable through a range of answer combinations, 2 solid secondary responses and 1 number 1, or a single strong number 1 and 2 decent secondaries. It was not a number that required extraordinary performance. It required competent, grounded play from a woman who had been described by 12 episodes of personal research and 2 weeks of family practice sessions as exactly capable of competent, grounded play. Vivienne walked to the podium. The studio had the quality it tends to have when a second fast money player inherits a strong foundation, expectant rather than tense, leaning toward celebration rather than suspense. The audience was with the Osai family. The number was manageable. The day, by every visible indicator, was about to end well. Steve Harvey came to stand beside Vivienne. He looked at her with the same attentive directness he brought to all fast money contestants, reading the room, reading the person, calibrating what the next 60 seconds was likely to contain. "Vivienne," he said, "Nathan gave you a strong number. You need 56. You comfortable?" "I'm comfortable," she said. "Anything you want to tell us before we start?" She considered this for a moment, a brief pause, not of uncertainty but of selection, the pause of someone who has decided how much to say and is choosing the right starting point. "I'm a grief counselor," she said. "I spend my days helping people find words for the things they cannot say. Sometimes being asked a direct question and having to answer it quickly is the most clarifying thing that can happen to a person." She looked at Steve Harvey directly. "Ask me the questions." Steve Harvey looked at her for a moment. 20 seconds, he said. "Here we go. Name something people say to make someone feel better." Vivienne answered without hesitation. "I'm here." Name the most important thing in a marriage. "Showing up." Name something people do when they don't know what to say. "Sit quietly." Name what love looks like on its hardest day. Vivienne was still for 1 full second, the only stillness in the round, and then she said, in the exact voice she used in her counseling sessions when she was saying something she believed completely, "Staying anyway." There was one question remaining. Steve Harvey had not yet asked it. The board had not yet shown 4 answers, but something had already changed in the room, not the score, not the format, not the mechanics of the game, something else, the quality of the air. The specific attentiveness of 200 people who had been watching a game show and had, in the space of 3 answers, begun doing something different. They were listening, not to the game, to the person. Steve Harvey felt it. The production team monitoring the cameras felt it. Nathan, standing behind the partition, felt it, felt the shift in the room's texture the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure, not through any single identifiable thing, but through the totality of the air. He pressed his hand flat against the partition wall and did not move. Steve Harvey asked the 5th question. "Name something that never really goes away." The audience expected grief. They were positioned for it. The setup was there, the profession was there, the shape of what the afternoon had been building toward was visible from where they sat, and they were ready to receive the expected answer with the warmth and recognition it deserved. Vivienne did not say grief. She said, Love, one word. 200 people did not move. Steve Harvey stood completely still. In 30 years of hosting this show, across thousands of episodes and tens of thousands of answers, he had developed a reflexive, professional response to every answer a contestant gave, an immediate, calibrated read of whether it was correct, whether it was close, whether it was a miss. The reflex did not fire. He stood with the word in the air between them, and the word did not move, and the room did not move, and Steve Harvey, who had been stopped by very few things in 30 years, was stopped. He turned, after a moment that the production team later estimated at 4 seconds, to the board. He read the first 4 answers. I'm here, number 1 answer, 42 points. Showing up, number 1 answer, 31 points. Sit quietly, number 1 answer, 27 points. Staying anyway, number 1 answer, 38 points. The room was entirely on its feet, but entirely silent. The specific, rare combination of a standing audience that is not making noise because the noise would cost them something they do not want to lose. And the last answer, Steve Harvey said. His voice had the quality it had when he was choosing every word with exceptional deliberateness because the words mattered beyond the game. You said love, for something that never really goes away. He turned to the board. Survey said. The board turned. Number 1 answer. 51 points. Total, 189 points. The silence held for 1 more second. Then the room released fully, completely, in the way of a space that has been holding something larger than its ordinary capacity and has just been given permission to let it go. The standing ovation was immediate and total, and sustained in a way that the production team, reviewing the footage afterward, noted had lasted longer than any non-reunion episode ovation in their recent records. Vivienne did not move from the podium. She stood with her hands flat on its surface and looked at the board, at the 5 answers, at the 5 number 1 confirmations, at the word love in the position the survey had placed it, and her expression was not triumph. It was recognition. The expression of a person who has said something true and watched it confirmed, which is a different kind of satisfaction than winning, and which she was more familiar with than most. Nathan came through the partition first. He reached his mother and held her, and she held him, and neither of them spoke for a long time. When they separated, he looked at her face and she looked at his, and what passed between them, what the camera caught and what every person watching the clip would feel without being able to name, was the specific, shared knowledge of 2 people who carry the same absence and have learned, separately and together, to carry it as love rather than loss. Steve Harvey came to stand with them. He was not performing composure, but he was working to maintain it, and the effort was visible in the specific, careful way he was constructing his sentences. Vivienne, he said, I need to ask you something. The last answer, love, for something that never really goes away. Was that the grief counselor answering, or was that something else? Vivienne looked at him. She did not hesitate. I lost my husband when I was 29, she said. Nathan was 18 months old. I have spent the 24 years since then sitting with people in the hardest experience a human being can be asked to have. And the thing I know with more certainty than anything else I know professionally or personally is this: grief does not go away, but grief is not what persists. What persists is the love that the grief is made of. Grief is just love with nowhere to go. Eventually, if you let it, it finds somewhere. She looked at Nathan. It found Nathan, she said. It found this work. Found the people I sit with every Thursday evening in a room where the most honest things anyone will ever say get said. She turned back to Steve Harvey. Love never goes away. I have seen that proven in room after room for 24 years. Today it just happened to be proven on a different kind of board. Steve Harvey was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, in the voice of a man who has received something and is acknowledging that he has received it, grief is just love with nowhere to go. Repeated it, not as performance, as retention, the way a person repeats something they want to make sure they do not lose. I have never heard that before, he said, and I will never forget it. The episode aired 4 weeks after the taping. The clip was shared more widely than any the production team had prepared for at that volume, and it was shared differently from the clips that typically circulated from the show. It was not shared primarily by entertainment accounts or game show enthusiasts. It was shared by grief counselors, by hospice workers, by bereaved spouses and parents and siblings, by therapists who sent it to colleagues, and by people in the middle of loss who sent it to themselves. Archived, saved, returned to. The sentence, grief is just love with nowhere to go, entered circulation independently from the clip, stripped of its context, carried by people who had received it as the accurate language for something they had been living inside without having had the words for. Vivienne had not coined the phrase. It had appeared in grief literature before in various forms. The sentiment was not new to the field. What was new, or rather what was made newly available by the clip, was the context in which it was spoken. Not in a clinical setting, not in a book, but by a woman standing at a game show podium who had just said love was the number one answer for something that never goes away, and who was then asked directly whether she was speaking professionally or personally, and who answered with a completeness and simplicity that the clinical setting does not always make possible. The response from bereaved people specifically, not from the professional community, but from individuals, was, in Vivienne's own words, the most significant professional development of her career, measured not by scale but by quality. The messages she received were not fan mail. They were correspondence from people who had found, in 4 minutes of television, the first accurate description of their own interior experience that they had encountered. They wrote to say that they had been trying to explain to people around them why their grief was not going away, and had been receiving, in response, the well-meaning but inaccurate reassurance that it would diminish over time. They wrote to say that the distinction Vivienne had made between grief diminishing and love persisting had given them a framework that made their own experience legible in a way that the standard consolations had not. She answered as many of those messages as her schedule permitted. She directed people to resources. She identified in the volume and consistency of the need being expressed, a gap that she had suspected for years, and was now seeing confirmed at a scale that clarified what she needed to do about it. She began writing a third book, not an academic text, not a training manual, but a book addressed to bereaved people directly, explaining in plain language the framework she had been applying in clinical settings for 2 decades. The book's working title was The Sentence from the Podium, which she had decided, after some reflection, was close enough to her own formulation that she was willing to stand in it publicly. Nathan read the first 3 chapters on a Sunday evening in October, sitting at his mother's kitchen table with a cup of tea, and called her the next morning to tell her it was the best thing she had written. She told him he was biased. He told her that was true, and also that it was the best thing she had written. She put his assessment in the same category she put most things Nathan said: credible, specific, and likely to be correct. The $20,000 prize was divided with the practical clarity that characterized most of Vivienne's decisions. A portion went toward the supervised practicum program at her organization, specifically, toward stipends for the trainee counselors, many of whom were, as she had been, in their late 20s and early 30s, and managing financial constraints alongside the demands of clinical training. A portion went to Nathan, who she told simply deserved it, a framing he accepted without argument because he had learned that arguing with his mother about what was deserved was an exercise that consumed time without producing results. The remainder went toward a research partnership she had been in conversations about for 2 years with a university grief research program, a study of long-term outcomes for bereaved spouses who had received sustained grief counseling versus those who had not. She had been waiting for the funding to move forward. Now she had it. 6 months after the taping, Steve Harvey opened the follow-up segment by saying that the sentence Vivienne had said, "Grief is just love with nowhere to go," had been, in the months since the episode aired, the most repeated thing said on his stage in any recent season. He said it had been sent to him by his own production staff. He said one of his writers had printed it and taped it to the wall above her desk. He said he himself had used it in a conversation with someone close to him who was navigating a loss, and that it had been received as the useful, clarifying thing it was. He asked Vivienne, sitting across from him with Nathan beside her, what she made of the sentence's reach. She said she made of it what she made of every confirmation that something true had landed, gratitude without surprise. "The sentence is not surprising to me," she said. "The form in which it traveled is surprising. But the truth of it is not. I have watched it be true for 24 years. I am glad it has words now that more people can use." Steve Harvey asked Nathan what it had meant to him to be standing behind the partition when his mother gave that answer. Nathan was quiet for a moment. He was 23 years old and had his father's laugh and his mother's deliberateness, and the deliberateness on this question was being deployed fully. "I didn't hear it as an answer to a question," he said. "I heard it as something she was telling me, because she has been telling me my whole life that the way my father is still present is through what he loved and what she loves and what I have been given by both of them." He paused. "I knew my father through my mother's grief, and her grief was always warm. It was never cold. I didn't understand that when I was small. I understand it now. The warmth was the love, that's what she was saying. She was saying it to the room, but I knew she was also saying it to me." Vivienne did not look at Nathan while he spoke. She looked at her hands, folded in her lap, with the expression of a woman receiving something she has spent 24 years preparing him to be able to give. When he finished, she looked up. She did not say anything. She placed her hand over his once briefly, in the gesture that Abina had recognized on the day of the taping as the most efficient communication she had ever witnessed. Steve Harvey looked at the two of them for a long moment. Then he looked at the camera with the directness he used for the things he wanted received clearly. "I have been in this business for 30 years, he said. "I have asked a lot of questions, and I have received a lot of answers. Most answers tell you something about the question. The best answers tell you something about the person." He paused. "Vivienne Osa gave me an answer that told me something about love, and I mean that in the specific, non-sentimental way. She told me what love actually does when the person it belongs to is gone. She told me it finds somewhere." He looked at Nathan. "And it did." The follow-up segment ended there. The production team left that as the final image, Nathan's hand under his mother's. The two of them in the studio where, 6 months earlier, she had stood at a podium and said one word that stopped 30 years of professional composure cold. That confirmed what the survey of 100 ordinary people had independently concluded, that arrived from a place too deep and too true for strategy or performance to have produced. Love, the thing that never really goes away, the #1 answer.